It's almost impossible for a movie franchise to move beyond certain aspects of its source material. This is one of the reasons why, even though Ellen Ripley was liquidized in Alien 3, they still found a way to bring her back in Alien Resurrection. Predator 2 suffered by not having Arnold Schwarzenegger in the film, even though the movie series is called Predator and not Dutch. Once an audience gets attached to a certain aspect of a franchise, they won't let it go. They replaced Kate Beckinsale in Underworld Rise of the Lycans, and no one went to see it. No Paul Walker and no Vin Diesel in Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift? No audience either. Some movies try to change everything, and even if the movie is good, audiences will still cry foul. Case in point is this week's movie, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Before I get into that though, let's go back to the start. In 1978, John Carpenter released the original Halloween. The movie was a small independent feature that cost around $325,000 to make and would go on to gross over $70 million. For the next 21 years, the movie remained the most financially successful independent film of all time until it was dethroned in 1999 by the Blair Witch Project. While Halloween was not the first slasher film, it is the template by which a lot of other slashers followed. Even though Peeping Tom, Black Christmas, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out before it, it was Halloween that popularized the subgenre. If not for the overwhelming success of the film, movies like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street may never have been greenlit. After the success of the original, the studio wanted a sequel. John Carpenter was busy focusing on other things at the time and expressed how he had little interest in directing the sequel, since he did the film once and didn't want to do it again. So instead of directing it, he chose to write and produce the film. Next, John Carpenter wanted Tommy Lee Wallace to direct since he worked with him on the original film. He declined, and eventually they got newcomer Rick Rosenthal to direct the film. While the movie did go on to be successful at the box office, it wasn't as big a hit as the original. Still, the studio saw franchise potential. John Carpenter really didn't want to make another Michael Myers film, but the studio basically informed him that they were going to make another film whether he was involved or not. He opted to stay involved and managed to convince the studio to take the series in a different direction. Carpenter and producer Deborah Hill had the idea to turn the franchise into an anthology series. Every year there would be a different Halloween-themed horror film from a different writer and director. Considering how much material could revolve around the holiday, this seemed like a recipe for success. With that one decision, the legend of Michael Myers almost stopped with his death at the end of Part 2. Joe Dante was the first pick to direct, but since the film was taking too long to get underway, he left to go work on the film that would eventually become Gremlins. Tommy Lee Wallace, who's the production designer on the first movie, was brought in to direct. He agreed to do Halloween 3 because he was excited with the potential to do something different, and not just a continuation of the Michael Myers story. Wallace was not a fan of sequels and called them a disease in Hollywood. Carpenter and Hill came back to produce, and they came up with a concept for the film, Witchcraft Meets the Computer Age. Carpenter didn't want to write this one, so they brought in famous British sci-fi writer Nigel Kneale. Dino De Laurentiis, the film's distributor, was unhappy with Kneale's screenplay. He passed it off to Carpenter and Wallace and asked them to add in more gore. Kneale was disgusted with the changes and asked to have his name removed from the credits. Carpenter also asked to have his name removed, so even though 3 people wrote this, Tommy Lee Wallace is the only one credited. He said that even though he has sole writing credit on the film, about 60% of it was still Nigel Kneale's work. When casting the lead, Deborah Hill suggested Tom Atkins, who she had just worked with on both The Fog and Escape from New York. She wanted him as the lead because he wasn't the typical pretty boy hero movies have a tendency to use. He was an older, grittier, and all-around more interesting character. Plus, Tom Atkins kicks ass. How awesome is Tom Atkins? While working on Night of the Creeps, Atkins met up with a then-unknown Shane Black, who was writing a little movie called Lethal Weapon. He envisioned Atkins as the role for Riggs, but the studio decided to go with Mel Gibson. He still wanted Atkins in the film, so he ended up with the role of Hunsaker. Stacey Nelkin was brought in to play Ellie. She had mostly done TV up to this point, so getting the lead in such a film was a huge break. She was hired immediately after she did her read for the role. Dan O'Hurley was cast as the villain Cochran. He's mostly known for his roles in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and RoboCop. Now with the leads cast and the director in place, the film was set to move forward. The movie only had a $2.5 million budget, which was fairly small considering the scope of the film. As I said earlier, the script was about witchcraft meeting the computer age. The witchcraft comes from the Irish warlock Cochran. His plan revolved around the pagan holiday of Samhain. Cochran and his company, the Silver Shamrock, were famous mask makers. This year they were heavily pushing 3 masks. The masks included a microchip that when exposed to a special commercial that would air on Halloween night, it would do something horrendous to whoever was wearing it. Since they wanted to move this series away from Michael Myers, you don't get much further than an Irish warlock that builds robots and makes masks for children in a grand conspiracy that'll make everyone wearing a mask have their head melt into a puddle of snakes and insects on Halloween. Pretty messed up and a complete departure from where the original series was going. The masks were made by Don Post Studios. The Skull and the Witch were masks that were already out, but Tommy Lee Wallace wanted to add a new mask that was distinctively tied to Halloween. After going back and forth, they eventually decided on the Jack-o'-lantern. Now they had 3 masks, which also tied into this being the 3rd movie. To help save money, the Mask Factory scenes were filmed in Don Post Studios. All the scenes filmed of them making masks were actually them creating product that was headed to the store. So if you have a Don Post witch, skull, or jack-o'-lantern mask, there's a possibility it was made during the film. One of the things Wallace liked about the script was even though the first 2 Halloweens took place on the holiday, this was the first one to incorporate it into the story. If you're a fan of the original Halloween, then you probably already know the working title of the film was The Babysitter Murders. The producer, Irwin Yablans, suggested they change it to Halloween, which sounded like the perfect match for a horror film. Although realistically, you could have had the film take place on almost any other day and it would have been just as effective. The holiday did little to impact the actual story, whereas in Halloween 3, the entire film revolved around what would happen to the children on Halloween night if they were wearing the silver shamrock masks. The majority of the film was shot in real locations, with the exception of the Stonehenge room, which was done on a soundstage. The soundstage was the same one where they filmed The Fog and Assault on Precinct 13. The rest of the film was mostly shot in Sierra Madre and Lolita, California. The exteriors of the Silver Shamrock was actually a powdered milk factory. When Atkins is on the phone, right down the street is the church from the finale of The Fog. The bar of the film is the Buccaneer in Sierra Madre, California. Not much has changed since they made the film, and the paintings and the mural behind the bar are still there. Tommy Lee Wallace was a huge fan of the original 1956 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, so he placed a few homages in the film. The name of the town where the Silver Shamrock factory was located was Santa Mira, which was the name of the town in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It was also shot in Sierra Madre, which is where they filmed the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The ending of Halloween 3 was also a nod to the movie, with Tom Atkins yelling into the phone in a way that was very reminiscent of the "You're Next" ending of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The studio wanted to change the movie to a happy ending, but John Carpenter had creative control, so he left it up to Wallace. Wallace said he wanted the bad ending because the hero doesn't always win. A down ending is much more interesting because it doesn't happen all that often. Dean Cundey was the director of photography, and he's worked with John Carpenter for years. He's since gone on to work in numerous huge productions like Back to the Future, Jurassic Park, and Apollo 13. For Cochrane's robotic Irish henchmen, Tommy Lee Wallace wanted all redheads. Unfortunately, they couldn't find them, so they went with the best menacing extras they could find. The lead robot, called the Assassin, was stuntman Dick Warlock, who played Michael Myers in Halloween 2. When Atkins goes home to see his kids, his ex-wife is played by Nancy Loomis, who was married to Tommy Lee Wallace at the time. She's the only actress to be in the first 3 Halloweens. Jamie Lee Curtis is sort of in all 3 movies as well. She starred in 1 and 2 and was the voice announcing the curfew over the loudspeaker in 3.
It's 6 o'clock. It's 6 o'clock. Curfew. Curfew.
She was also shown in footage from the original Halloween on the TV in the film. After this, she wouldn't return to the series until Halloween H2O, the 7th film in the series, and as far as I'm concerned, is where the series officially ended. Tom Atkins was married to Garn Stevens at the time. Garn played the lady staying next door to Chalice and Ellie. This adds a bit of dark humor to her death sequence, because while Chalice and Ellie are getting it on, she's dying a horrible death in the next room. Atkins' son in the movie was Joshua John Miller, who is the real-life son of Jason Miller, who was Father Damien from The Exorcist. He also played Louise's little brother in Teen Witch. John Carpenter and Alan Howarth did the amazing score for the film. When it came time for the Silver Shamrock, they didn't have enough time to work on the jingle. So Deborah Hill suggested they go with something public domain so they wouldn't have to worry about acquiring rights or getting sued. They took London Bridge and reworked it into the annoyingly catchy jingle you hear throughout the film.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
Tommy Lee Wallace sung the theme as a placeholder while they were looking for somebody else. They took it and sped it up, and the group thought it was so funny and worked perfectly, they decided to keep it. He was also the voice of the announcer for the ads.
Yes, kids, you too can own one of the big Halloween 3. That's right, 3 horrific masks to choose from.
While working on the film, Wallace and Carpenter thought it would be a good idea to have the switch of Ellie being replaced by a robot. This has an extra meaning because Stacey Nelkin was almost cast as a replicant in Blade Runner. Showing how much of a pro Atkins is, he acted the whole movie without complaining once, even though he had walking pneumonia throughout most of it. The scene where little Buddy is dying excruciatingly while bugs and snakes crawl out of his face was a tad too much for the MPAA. They trimmed it back by a few seconds and were able to get the film released with an R rating. As it got closer to the release of the film, Wallace realized that audiences wanted Michael Myers. As the production was wrapping up, they tagged the movie with the title Season of the Witch, which was a song by Donovan that Tommy Lee Wallace liked. He thought it suited the movie more and tried to get the studio to release the film as Season of the Witch and not Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. He argued with the studio but was overruled. He called the Halloween name the biggest problem with the film. He said what got the movie made was also its curse. If it wasn't called Halloween, it never would have been funded. But ultimately being tied to the name was what people were going to hate about it, since it wasn't the sequel that they wanted. After all the work that went into the film, it was finally released on October 22nd, 1982. Audiences flocked to the movie, and it only lost out to the top spot on opening weekend because it was up against First Blood. There was a major backlash, though. The trailers never really expressed to the audience that the film wouldn't include Michael Myers, so fans of the series were outraged by his absence. Critics hated it and the people booed it. The studio then ditched any and all hopes to continue the series as an anthology. For years it drifted off into obscurity, and it wasn't until 7 years later when the series was revived in Halloween 4. They wanted to make sure that audiences knew the shape was returning, so they called it Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. People eventually forgot about Halloween 3, or they referred to it as that weird side story in the series. As time went on and the quality of the Halloween films declined, the movie was rediscovered. A lot of horror fans that dismissed the film when they were younger were recognizing this as an odd departure that was way more entertaining than it ever got credit for. The film grew in popularity and cemented itself as a cult hit. While it wasn't achieving the success of the original movies, it also was no longer looked upon with disgust like it was in 1982. There's still more folks out there that dislike the film, but many of them are holding a grudge from all those years ago. If you're one of those people, give the movie another chance. It was recently remastered and released on DVD and Blu-ray, and it looks tremendous. I could see if the movie was just campy bad entertainment, but it's not. It's a well-done and uniquely different kind of horror film. The hero is a middle-aged divorced borderline alcoholic. The heroine doesn't get rescued. The hero saves some people, but in the end, the villain's plan still comes to fruition. This was not your average horror film, especially back in 1982. I'll end with this. When Halloween 3 was first released, it was a monumental failure. But what if it wasn't? If audiences had embraced the idea, we could have had years of cleverly unique Halloween-themed horror films. Of course, the downside would have been that was the end of Michael Myers. Also, we most likely wouldn't have been introduced to future Scream Queen Danielle Harris in Halloween 4, and we never would have had the grand ending of H2O. Although on the positive side, it would have saved us all the embarrassment of seeing Michael Myers getting his ass kicked by Busta Rhymes.
Where do you want to sleep, Dr. Chalice?
That's a dumb question, Miss Grimbridge.